Okay, we're going to start to look at the idea of the benefits of trade, but now we're going to look at the effect on the market. So once you've done the idea of comparative advantage, it's actually worthwhile starting to think about an individual market, because it'll help us later on when we do protectionism and how this is going to affect the market. So the idea is that in this market here, you have your usual demand curve for a particular product. Let's say it's a car. And you have a domestic supply curve, a home supply curve, okay? In which case the equilibrium will be here, the price in the market would be over here, and the output being produced would be here. Standard sort of diagram. Okay, now we're going to ask ourselves, what would happen if the world price was lower than the domestic price? So the supply curve that is facing this market is this supply curve here, at this lower price than the domestic market would be supplying at. And where we get this price from is that there is a world market out here somewhere, and there's a demand and supply in the world, and the market gives us this price here, which is this price here, which is then fed into the domestic market. Now we draw a straight line here because we assume that this economy here is actually so small in terms of what it wants from this car market that it's not going to affect the overall demand too much, and therefore we can buy all that we want at the going price. So there's a simplifying assumption just to make it easier. Now, the question is, what would happen in this case? Well, this is going to be, this red line here is going to be your new supply curve. So the idea is, if you think back here, this is the UK, for example, the domestic market being able to supply. And where would the consumers buy from? Would they buy at this low price, or would they buy at a world price, which is up here? So the argument is that these levels of output here, as you go along here, we're going to buy from the domestic market because the home supply is less than the world supply price. When you get to this point, however, we wouldn't be buying from the home suppliers anymore because we can move on to a lower price and buy from the world market. And so this red line, it's always worth doing this, is going to be your supply curve. Now, if that is the new supply curve and this is the demand curve, then basically what will happen is that we'll get another equilibrium point here where demand and supply are equal. And that means that the UK consumers, instead of consuming this quantity at this lower price now, because we've opened ourselves up to trade, are going to benefit because they can increase their demand. It's an extension of demand along the demand curve, and they're going to demand Q1. We now need to ask ourselves, okay, well, who's going to supply that? And so this point here shows us that at Q2, that's going to be the home supply, and the reasoning is that at any output here between the origin and Q2, we're going to be supplying, the home market's going to be supplying it because they can do so at a lower price. There's the world price, there's the home price. So all of this output from here to here will be supplied by the home market. In other words, this is home supply. But we've now got a problem, because if that is the demand and this is what we can supply at home, then the distance between here and here are going to be the imports into the market. So the effect on the market, when you look at it, is without trade the price is P0 and Q0, but with trade the price is going to fall in the market. Home supply though is going to fall, so there'll be a reduction in home supply to this point here, but this amount here is going to be imported. Okay, so we need to then think a little bit more about this and how that's affecting the economic agents, let's say the government, the firms, consumers. And so we have a look at this diagram. We need to split it up into some bits. Now, what's the effect of consumers in this home economy? Well, the price is going to fall from P0 to P1. This means that real incomes will rise, and so will their living standards. In other words, if they were buying cars at this price, but now they can buy it at this price, then they have real income's rising because they can afford to buy different goods, more of the other goods because they're not spending so much on their cars, and so they'll have a rise in the living standards. And also, hope you can see that the consumer surplus, which was this area here, has now risen to this area here. And so this shape, P0, E0, E1, A, PW, is going to be the consumer surplus increase. The effect on the firms, however, is that in the home economy here, their output is falling from Q0 to Q2. So there's going to be a reduction in the output of, in this case, UK firms. So jobs will be lost in the domestic market, profits will fall, and also their producer surplus, which was this area here, has now gone down to this area here, and so they lose a surplus which is equivalent to this area here. So that's a quite neat way of looking at it in terms of the surpluses. Let's just sort of widen it out a little bit more. What's the further thoughts on consumers? Well, remember, with trade they get greater choice. They can purchase goods that they can't physically produce themselves. That's the sort of comparative advantage idea. But one of the drawbacks is that they're buying goods from countries which may have lower standards, so you've got to be careful of that one. Okay, it's worth just bringing that in terms of some balance to, that consumers will always benefit. What's about firms and governments? Well, there's going to be lower inflation. The price of finished goods coming into the market, so the price of my cars is going to go down. And it's also worth widening out this analysis to say, if those goods that we were just talking about in that market were, say, raw materials, then the raw material prices have gone down, and therefore there's going to be lower cost push inflation. So always bring in the two types of inflation. One of the other benefits is that if UK firms are now facing more competition, then it may force them to be more efficient in order to compete in the long run. Now we'll see in a minute that it may not, and so it's a really nice sort of balance to have there. There'll be some domestic firms who can't, who can then produce at lower cost. So the market that we've looked at is the UK market, and we see that the firms in our market, the UK firms, have reduced their output, but imports have come in. But you've got to switch to the other markets, okay? And then if the other countries are opening themselves up to trade as well, it might be that some of the imports into their market, same diagram but the different market, this is their market, some of those importers, if we are efficient, might be UK firms. So UK manufacturers of cars might be able to export more to them if both the UK and other countries simultaneously open themselves up to trade. So that's quite an important one to try and get in. And also, as firms specialize, of course, because comparative advantage, remember, means that they specialize, they might enjoy economies of scale and reduce their costs further in order, because of the idea of scale economies, and that then makes them even more competitive in the longer run. That's called a dynamic sort of efficiency. Okay. But there's some drawbacks. Well, it might mean, it depends how competitive the firms are, that we might end up with a trade deficit when we open ourselves up to trade. Some firms, of course, might have to shut down, as I say here. They're not competitive enough. And that can lead then to a loss of capital and skilled labour, that we've built up this good labour and capital in our industry, but now we're opening ourselves up to trade. Some of that might be lost capital and labour. And of course, there may therefore be structural unemployment. The unemployment occurs because of structural change in the economy, and also if the industry that we're talking about there is based in regions, then it obviously might also be some, as I say, regional unemployment. So hopefully that helps you to see the benefits of trade from a microeconomic point of view, and it's quite useful to use that, and we will be using it later on as well.